Hello and welcome to Games from Folktales, a podcast that mixes historical research and tabletop role-playing settings. I'm your host, Timothy Ferguson. This evening I'm coming to you in the middle of a night storm in Australia, so hopefully I'll be able to edit most of this background noise out. Anyway, tonight I'd like to talk to you about Strange Tales from a Chinese Studio Volume 1, which was the 10,000th recorded LibriVox free audiobook. One of the reasons I'm fascinated with Chinese folktales is that towards the end of the Ars Magica setting, we started to run out of things that people hadn't seen before, and so to cheat, we would harvest other people's folktales and embed them into the European setting. For example, there's a Japanese spirit, a sort of faceless person, that if you're looking in the last few Ars Magica books you may see and go, aha, I know where you've stolen that from. So, I first became aware of Stories from a Chinese Studio a couple of years ago, and I deliberately decided not to read it because it had too much good material, and I was busy working through other material for what I thought then was the North African book, and turned out instead to be the North African and Egyptian books. It's a series of short folk tales, and the person who's telling them appears to believe that they're true, which means that sometimes they end abruptly, in the same way that sometimes when you read biographies, the person is heroic up until a certain point, and then the life just seems to taper away. Similarly, in these stories, something amusing happens, or amazing happens, and then that's it. Done. The stories have also, in this edition, been boulderized within an inch of their lives. I'm not saying that Giles, who did the translation, was incredibly sex-averse, but he was a Victorian gentleman writing for other Victorian gentlemen, and he used a vast degree of inventiveness to remove anything vaguely erotic from the stories. Many of the stories deal with people who have fairy wives, or fox wives because this is a Chinese studio, but let's ignore those for now. One of the early stories, and one of my favourites, involves a man who goes blind because a film appears over each of his eyes. Trapped as he is in the darkness, he starts hearing voices, and he thinks he's going insane, but it becomes clear to him that the things that are talking are creatures that live inside his eyeballs, and they have become disconsolate because they haven't seen the sunlight in a while. They crawl out his nose, go on an adventure, crawl back in, and sit around talking to each other about how his garden's been neglected since he's gone blind. When he confronts his wife about this confirms to him that these are not symptoms of madness, but actual spiritual beings who've taken up residence in his head. After many nights of this, one of the creatures becomes sick of all this crawling in and out of noses, and decides to create a door. It tries to split open the film in the front of his eye. It fails to do this, but it encourages the other one, which does much the same, and this time does manage to break open the film in the front of his eye, allowing the man to see again. The two creatures in his eyes then have a little bit of a discussion, and one agrees to come and live with the other, leading to another quick trip down one nostril and up the other, and from that day the man had two pupils in his right eye, which allowed him to see more clearly than any other man, despite being blind in his left. Following this, in Ars Magica terms, the man clearly has some sort of legendary perception score or some knack involving the awareness ability. It's not clear whether the creatures in his eye are fairies, and therefore he gains some sort of fairy sight, or whether he gains a sort of short-term skill similar to premonitions, where he becomes aware of danger because the creatures that have fairy sight in his eye gasp at things he cannot see, which leads him to take defensive actions of greater or lesser effectiveness. Similarly, it's not clear whether this is meant to be a horror story. Are you meant to think, wait a minute, I have pupils, we all have pupils, are everyone's pupils tiny men sitting behind windows? Giles, the translator, claims that, yes, this is exactly what you're meant to think. He believes that all Chinese people believe that there are little human-shaped figures in the back of your eyeballs, a superstition which is caused by seeing your own reflection reflected off a mirror into your eyeballs and back onto the mirror. But let's leave that to Giles and move on with other stories. Ancient Chinese body horror, hard to tell. Another story I particularly like is about an elderly woman who has one son, and her son is taken by a tiger. A passing monk upbraids the tiger and says, "How is this woman to live now that you've eaten her son? This is entirely inappropriate behavior." And so the tiger adopts the woman and starts leaving dead deer on her porch. Each day, another dead deer. Eventually, the woman starts to feel more friendly toward the tiger, and she coaxes it up to sleep on her veranda. The woman is quite rich by this time, because a deer a day is quite something when you live in medieval China, but no one wants to burgle her house because there's literally a tiger lying across her doorway. Eventually, she and the tiger become such great friends that it wanders around carrying things for her, helping her with her shopping, those sorts of things. It's like the tiger who came for tea, except it starts by eating her son. Eventually, the tiger bursts into her house and mourns her after her death. I quite like this idea that a saint has accidentally put an incredibly dangerous creature into the middle of a town, where it does nothing particularly scary except camp out on the veranda of an old woman. I wonder how this would play in mythic Europe, where poaching deer is illegal, and where elderly women who had suspicious-seeming cats were sometimes accused of being witches. Well, actually, that's far later, during the Ars Magica period. People didn't believe that witches really existed. They thought people who thought they were witches were mentally ill. But leaving that aside, what can you do if a saint has accidentally handed a woman a tiger, or perhaps in mythic Europe, a wolf? Well, you can just wait, and after she passes away, you have a mystical tiger, or wolf, that you could adopt as a familiar. You could see if there's something particular to the woman. Perhaps she has the virtue that makes animals particularly friendly. If so, she may prove a resource when dealing with similar creatures, particularly given the way that most animals react to magi. There is one story in which a character asks for his fortune to be told, and the magician in the marketplace says, "Oh, you're going to die very quickly, but I can prevent it from happening with one of my charms." The person refuses the assistance of the necromancer, and so the necromancer sends spirits to kill the man, so that his reputation of being able to tell the future is not besmirched. Of particular interest to hermetic magi is a tiger that only attacks scholars. It seems to attack a scholar at least once every year, and the spirit of whichever scholar it has most recently killed is forced to serve it until a new scholar dies. In the story, the ghost of one of the scholars contacts a friend and gets them to trick a teacher that they both disliked into coming to the Mountain of the Tiger so that that person is attacked. When I saw this, I was reminded of a tradition found in British folktales of what's called a fag corpse. The idea is that the last person buried in a graveyard, their ghost becomes the servant of the other ghosts who are there, and so rich people would make very sure that directly after their funeral was the funeral of a peasant, so that rather than them having to serve all the peasants in the same graveyard, they would only have to fulfill their wishes for a matter of moments before a new servant would take their place. There is also mention of a poisonous plant called the shuemang. I'm probably mispronouncing that. Whoever takes this plant dies and becomes a ghost, their business being that they cannot rest until they have poisoned someone else with the plant. One of the gentlemen, who is a very strong moral character, who takes the plant, chooses not to poison anyone else. He does this in part out of filial piety. He continues his worldly works and supports his mother until eventually the various immortals, noticing what he's doing, give him a role in the celestial bureaucracy, and he passes away, the curse thereby having ended. This reminded me of the oldest of the ghosts at the Cave of Twisting Shadows, which in Sanctuary of Ice it is mentioned is a woman who poisoned herself, her worldly business being to wait for the return of Creaman. In another story there is a magic rock which has many tiny grottos in it, one of which closes after each year, so the person who owns the rock can tell how long they are going to live. There are a set of dryads linked not to trees, but to individual flowers. There are magicians who are able to stretch and extend their limbs in a way that reminded me of Mr. Tickle, if any of you are Mr. Men fans. There is mention of the nation of Flying Heads. a kingdom where people's heads fly off and go down to the marshy lands to eat worms and so forth, and it's considered completely normal by the people who live thereabouts. Well, not so much normal as something that's not entirely mystical. There are similar magicians in Hungary that can detach parts of their bodies and send them off travelling, but none of them actually has a flying head so far as I'm aware. There is a mention in the footnotes that wine may go to different organs of the body, and by striking those organs have different effects. If it hits the heart, it makes maudlin emotions. The liver causes people to become pugnacious. The stomach causes drowsiness. To the lungs, which produces hilarity, or to the kidneys, which causes desire. There is the story of a man who is swept out to sea and lands on the island of the cannibals, which are troglodytic fairies. He refers to them as demons. He manages to avoid being eaten by showing them how to cook meat, and eventually, to keep him happy, they give him a troglodyte wife. They have 2 sons, and he eventually escapes to the mainland, where, because they have blood of virtue, they rise high in the army. His wife is absolutely hideous, something which she is aware of, and so she refuses to go to the mainland until it becomes clear that her sons have become generals and her husband a high official. So, regardless of her hideousness, it is necessary for everyone around her to treat her as though she were attractive. This does not, so far as I can tell, actually make her attractive, although that would be an interesting outcome to the folk story. Strange Tales, or Strange Stories, different translations have different titles, from a Chinese studio is therefore an interesting grab bag, which I'd encourage you to have a bit of a look at. You can see scattered through this podcast little things that you could steal for Ars Magica campaigns. The material which I've dealt with in this podcast only covers the first volume of the book. I believe it's 5 volumes long.